What if the key to solving your own death was hidden in plain sight? Not in a locked room, or a coded diary, or a whispered secret, but in a single piece of paper, written in your own handwriting? In October 2008, 16-year-old Annie McCann left her home in Virginia for the last time. 5 days later, her body was found 100 miles away in Baltimore, slumped inside a dumpster, decomposing under a pile of trash. Beside her was a note she wrote, a note that should have answered every question. But instead, it made the truth vanish. Let me read it to you. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. I've thought about this for a long time. I love you all. Please don't blame yourselves. At first glance, it sounds like a suicide letter. But here's the problem. Annie's parents say she wrote those words days before she disappeared. Days before she climbed into her parents' car. A car she'd never driven alone and vanished. Days before she ended up dead from a cocktail of poisons so bizarre, so agonizing, that even seasoned detectives froze when they saw the autopsy report. This isn't just a story about a girl who ran away. This is a story about a note that lied, a car that shouldn't have moved, a body that couldn't feel its own death, and a family who spent 15 years screaming into a void, begging for someone, anyone, to explain how a straight-A student, a devout Catholic, a girl terrified of failure, became a ghost in a landfill. But the darkest question isn't how Annie died. It's why. Why drive to a city she'd never visited? Why leave a suicide note? And then wait days to use it? And why? When the medical examiner sliced into her veins, did they find not just poison, but a numbing agent so strong, it would have silenced her pain, her fear, even her screams? By the time this story ends, you won't just doubt the official verdict. You'll doubt every assumption you've ever made about guilt, grief, and the lies we tell ourselves to survive. Because Annie McCann didn't just leave behind a body. She left behind a paradox, one that's still breathing and still begging to be solved. Annie McCann wasn't the kind of teenager who'd vanish. At least, that's what everyone said. The kind of girl who taped Bible verses to her bedroom mirror, who spent weekends volunteering at the local food pantry, who wrote nurse in block letters on her school notebooks, circling it like a prayer. Her parents described her as painfully shy, a straight-A student who'd panic if she scored less than 95% on a test. The neighbors? They saw a quiet 16-year-old who babysat their toddlers without ever asking for pay. But behind the halo of perfection, Annie was drowning. Her parents say she'd been haunted by a fear of failure since middle school. Not the ordinary teenage anxiety. This was visceral, crippling. She'd stay up until 3 a.m. rewriting homework assignments, terrified of a single typo. She'd hide report cards for days, hands shaking, convinced AB+ would shatter her future. And then there was the prom. Months before she vanished, Annie begged her parents to let her skip it, not because she didn't want to go, but because she was terrified of tripping in her heels, of being laughed at, of failing at something as simple as walking. But here's what no one talks about. Fear doesn't always look like tears or panic attacks. Sometimes, it's silent. It's a girl rehearsing conversations in the mirror, memorizing scripts to avoid saying the wrong thing. It's a teenager so afraid of disappointing her parents that she lied about getting a 98% on a chemistry test, when she'd actually scored 100. Annie didn't want to be perfect, she just didn't know how to be anything else. And that's what makes November 1st, 2008, so impossible to understand. The night before she disappeared, Annie sat at the dinner table, picking at her lasagna while her parents joked about her upcoming driver's test. She'd failed it twice already. Third time's the charm, her dad said. Annie forced a smile. Then she went upstairs, wrote a to-do list for the weekend, study, laundry, babysit the Millers, and fell asleep. The next morning, she was gone, but not gone like you're thinking. She didn't storm out, didn't slam doors. She left her glasses on her nightstand, her favorite sweater folded on the chair, and that to-do list, still sitting on her desk, every item unchecked. It's as if the girl who planned every second of her life simply stepped out of her own story. So who was Annie McCann? A saint? A victim? A stranger to everyone, including herself? Or just a kid who wanted the world to stop watching long enough for her to breathe? We'll never know, because the Annie her family describes, the girl who cried when her goldfish died, who donated her birthday money to homeless shelters, who folded her socks into perfect little squares, that Annie doesn't match the one who supposedly drove to Baltimore, swallowed poison, and died alone in the dark. Unless the Annie they knew was just another facade, another script, another perfect lie. Imagine waking up to silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that crushes, the kind where you just know, before your eyes even open, that something is wrong. That's how it started for the McCann's on November 1st, 2008, 5:47 a.m. A cold, gray dawn in Virginia. Annie's mother walked into her daughter's bedroom to wake her for school and found an empty bed, a cold pillow, and on the desk, a neon yellow sticky note with 5 words that would haunt them forever. I need to get away for a while. But here's what didn't make sense. Annie had never driven alone. Not once. She didn't have a license, just a learner's permit. And yet, the family's white Buick was gone. No tire marks, no shattered glass, no sign of struggle, just a missing girl, a missing car, and a note that felt rehearsed. Too calm, too clean, as if someone had written it while standing in the doorway, 1 foot already in the abyss. For 5 days, her family lived in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Her father drove back roads until his hands blistered on the steering wheel. Her mother called every hospital, every police station, every morgue within 200 miles. They printed flyers with Annie's smiling school photo and taped them to gas station windows, park benches, bus stops. Have you seen this girl? But the girl they described, the one who panicked over math quizzes and cried during horror movies, didn't match the ghost who'd vanished without a trace. Then, the break. A call from Baltimore, a parking lot 100 miles north. The white Buick sat abandoned. Doors locked, keys gone. When police pried it open, the stench hit them first, a sweet, chemical rot that made one officer gag. Antifreeze, gallons of it, pooled in the footwells, soaking the seats. But that wasn't the worst part. The car was spotless. No fingerprints, no blood, no strands of Annie's auburn hair. Just a half-empty water bottle and the lingering reek of poison. How does a 16-year-old who'd never driven farther than the grocery store navigate to Baltimore alone? How does a girl who panicked over parallel parking merge onto highways, dodge tolls, and vanish into a city she'd never visited? And why antifreeze, a toxin that kills slowly, agonizingly, burning your kidneys until you beg for death? The car was a clue, a taunt, a riddle wrapped in chemical smoke. Because when the police traced its path, they found nothing. No gas station footage, no toll booth receipts, no witnesses. It was as if the Buick had driven itself to Baltimore, and Annie McCann had never been inside it at all. 2 weeks after Annie vanished, a janitor opened a dumpster behind a Baltimore apartment complex. Inside was a body, decomposed, curled into itself like a question mark. Dental records confirmed it was Annie. But this wasn't a crime scene. No tape, no flashing lights, just a trash bag, a rotting landfill smell, and a handwritten letter tucked beneath her arm. A letter she wrote. A letter that should have ended the mystery, but only made it darker. The note was short, too short. "I'm sorry. I did this to myself. Please forgive me." And it was signed, in shaky cursive. Annie. At first glance, it looked like a confession, a suicide, case closed. But here's the problem. The letter was dated October 30th, 2 days before she disappeared. 2 days before she took that car. 2 days before she drove to Baltimore. Why write a suicide note? And then wait. Why pack a bag, steal a car, and run to another state just to die in a dumpster? The police didn't care. They called it a cut-and-dry suicide. But Annie's parents begged them to look closer, because the girl in that dumpster didn't match the girl they knew. The Annie they raised would have never chosen this, a cold, lonely death in the trash. She hated germs. She washed her hands until they cracked. She'd cry if her socks didn't match. This wasn't a goodbye. It was a performance. And then, the autopsy. Toxicology reports showed her body was flooded with 2 chemicals, antifreeze and lidocaine. Antifreeze, the same poison found in the car, burns your insides, leaving you dizzy, vomiting, desperate. Lidocaine? That's what dentists use to numb you. By the end, Annie wouldn't have felt the pain, wouldn't have felt anything. Her nerves dead, her mind adrift. But here's what the note didn't explain. How does a 16-year-old girl get her hands on lidocaine? Why mix it with antifreeze? And why write a letter before you decide to die, but leave it behind like a prop? The truth is, that note didn't solve anything. It just proved Annie McCann was telling a story, one nobody knows how to finish. Was it a cry for help that went too far? A twisted game staged by someone else? Or did she truly want to disappear so completely, so finally, that even her death would feel like a lie? The answer's still out there, buried in her bones, and in the silence of a dumpster that held more secrets than evidence. The police closed Annie's case in 40 days. 40 days to label her death a suicide. 40 days to dismiss the contradictions, the strange evidence, the screaming questions. But Annie's family refused to let her story end there, because every piece of this puzzle was broken. Start with the car. The white Buick was wiped clean, no fingerprints. Not even Annie's. How? She'd never driven it alone. She'd never even cleaned her room without leaving streaks on the mirror. And yet, the steering wheel, the door handles, the gear shift all bare, as if someone had scrubbed away every trace of her. Or someone else. Then there was the note, the suicide letter she'd supposedly written. It mentioned vodka. I drank vodka, it said. But Annie's body told a different story. The autopsy found no alcohol in her system. None. Instead, her veins were clogged with ethylene glycol, antifreeze. A poison so cruel, it tricks you at first. You feel drunk, giddy, then your kidneys fail. Your lungs flood. You die confused, in pain, begging for a relief that never comes. But Annie didn't drink antifreeze. She wouldn't. Her parents swore she hated bitter tastes. She'd spit out cough syrup as a kid. Even her friends said she refused to try beer at parties. So how did a girl who gagged at the smell of vinegar swallow enough antifreeze to kill a grown man? And why did the note lie about it? The police didn't ask. They called it a suicide and moved on. But let's walk through it. Let's pretend you're Annie. You're 16. You've never driven farther than your school. You're terrified of failure, of embarrassment, of getting a single hair out of place. Now imagine you decide to die. You write a note. You steal your parents' car. You drive 100 miles to a city you don't know. You park. You drink poison. Then, instead of dying in the car, you crawl into a dumpster. You close the lid, and you wait. Does that make sense? Does that sound like the same girl who had panic attacks over unmade beds? The family hired private investigators. They found a witness, a man who lived near the dumpster. He said he'd seen a girl matching Annie's description days after she supposedly died. She was alive. She was crying. She was with an older man in a red baseball cap. But when police questioned him, they said his story lacked credibility. They didn't check security cameras, didn't look for the man in the cap, just shrugged and closed the case. Then there's the lidocaine, the numbing agent. Annie had enough in her system to kill her twice over. But lidocaine isn't something you buy at a gas station. It's medical, controlled. You need a needle, a prescription, a doctor's order. So how did Annie get it? Did she steal it? Did someone inject her? And why pair it with antifreeze, a poison that causes unbearable pain, and a drug that numbs you to it? The police didn't care. They said she swallowed it, voluntarily, that she mixed lidocaine with antifreeze like some kind of science fair project. But here's the thing, lidocaine tastes bitter, metallic. Even if you crush it into a drink, you'd taste it. You'd spit it out. Unless you couldn't. Unless someone made you drink it. And what about the dumpster? Annie's body was found in a part of Baltimore known for drugs, gangs, and worse, a place a sheltered 16-year-old wouldn't know exists. How did she get there? Why there? Did she wander the streets for days, hallucinating from the poison, until she collapsed? Or did someone carry her? The family pushed for answers. They begged for the case to be reopened. They even tracked down a woman who claimed to have seen Annie at a bus stop, alive, 3 days after her disappearance. But the police said the woman was mistaken. They said the lidocaine was a red herring. They said the lack of fingerprints was inconsequential. But here's what they couldn't explain: fear. Annie's fear. The kind that kept her up at night, rewriting essays. The kind that made her too scared to drive. If she wanted to die, why choose such a slow, terrifying death? Why not pills? Why not a single gunshot? Why the antifreeze? The lidocaine? The dumpster? The lies? The truth is, the investigation was less about finding answers and more about avoiding questions. The toxicology report was buried. The witness statements were ignored. The red flags were painted white. Because suicide is simple. Suicide is quick. Suicide doesn't require detectives to dig through dumpsters or chase ghosts in red caps. But Annie's family still digs. They still scream into the void. Because they know the real mystery isn't how she died. It's why everyone stopped looking. Why the cops shrugged at the missing fingerprints. Why they didn't question the note's lies. Why they let a 16-year-old girl's death become a footnote in a file cabinet. And so the case stays cold. The evidence collects dust. And the only thing left is a question that nobody wants to answer. If this was a suicide, why does it feel so much like murder? The autopsy report was 12 pages long. 12 pages of cold, clinical facts that should have ended the mystery. Instead, it tore it wide open, because when the medical examiner sliced into Annie's veins, they found something that defied logic. Something dark. Something medical. Lidocaine. You've probably felt it before. That icy numbness at the dentist as the needle slides into your gum. Lidocaine deadens pain, silences nerves, turns your body into a stranger. But Annie didn't have a trace of it in her gums. She had it in her stomach. A lethal dose. Enough to kill her twice over. By the time she died, her body was so numb. She couldn't feel the antifreeze burning through her kidneys. Couldn't feel her lungs filling with fluid. Couldn't even feel her own heartbeat slowing to a stop. But here's what the police didn't say. You don't drink lidocaine. It's not a pill. It's not a powder. It's a liquid meant to be injected, to numb a specific tooth, a specific wound. If you swallow it, it's bitter, metallic, like licking a battery. Even a small dose makes your tongue feel like rubber. Your throat clenches. You gag. So how did Annie McCann, a girl who spit out cough syrup, swallow enough lidocaine to kill a horse? There are two possibilities. One, she wanted to die so badly. She fought through the taste. She crushed the vials, mixed them into a drink, choked it down. But that doesn't explain the antifreeze, the note, the spotless car, or why a 16-year-old with no medical training would pair a numbing agent with a poison that causes unbearable pain. Two, someone else did it. Someone who knew lidocaine would silence her. Someone who didn't want her to scream. Because here's the kicker. Lidocaine isn't something you buy at a CVS. It's controlled. Prescription only. Nurses log every vial. Dentists track every dose. So where did it come from? Did Annie steal it? Did she know someone with access? A doctor? A student? A dealer? Or did someone else bring it to her? Someone who wanted her dead, but didn't want her to suffer loud enough for anyone to hear? The police didn't ask. They called it a suicide and moved on. But let's follow the trail. Let's pretend you're Annie. You're in Baltimore. You're scared. You're dying. You have two poisons in your system. One to numb you. One to kill you. Why? If you wanted to die, why not just the antifreeze? Why the lidocaine? To make it painless? To make it quiet? Or maybe the lidocaine wasn't for her. Maybe it was for someone else. Maybe someone forced her to drink it first. To paralyze her. To make sure she couldn't fight back when they poured the antifreeze down her throat. To make sure she couldn't run, couldn't scream, couldn't even whimper as they carried her to the dumpster. But that's the problem with lidocaine. It doesn't leave clues. It dissolves. It fades. All that's left is a body too numb to show fear. A corpse with no scratches, no bruises, no signs of struggle. Just a chemical kiss that erased every scream. Annie's family begged for answers. They demanded to know how she got the lidocaine. The police said she must have ordered it online, but lidocaine isn't Amazon Prime. You need a prescription, a license, a paper trail. And Annie? She didn't even have a credit card. Then there's the dose. The amount in her system wasn't just lethal, it was excessive. Enough to numb an entire body, to stop a heart, to kill her long before the antifreeze did. So why both? Why not one or the other? Was it a mistake? An experiment? Or was the lidocaine meant to hide something else? A needle mark, a wound, a truth. The family hired a forensic toxicologist. He said the combination made no sense. Lidocaine and antifreeze don't interact. They don't amplify each other. They're two separate horrors. One numbs you, the other melts you. Together, they're not a suicide cocktail, they're a contradiction. A riddle. Unless the lidocaine was a message. A way to say, look how clever I am. A way to taunt investigators. A way to make Annie's death as confusing as her life. Because that's the cruelest twist of all. The very drug meant to silence pain became the loudest clue. A clue that no one followed. A clue that drowned in the noise of closed doors and closed minds. So here we are. A girl dead from a drug she couldn't get. A poison she couldn't swallow. And a truth that's still numb. Still frozen. Still waiting for someone brave enough to dig it out. To this day, no one agrees on what happened to Annie McCann. Was it an accident, a suicide, or something darker? Let's break down the theories and the holes in each one. Theory 1, the accident. Maybe Annie didn't mean to die. Maybe she ran away to escape the pressure, stole the car on a whim, and drank antifreeze by mistake. Antifreeze smells sweet. Looks like vodka. Maybe she thought it was alcohol. But here's the problem. Annie hated bitter tastes. She'd spit out toothpaste if it was too minty. And even if she did drink it accidentally, why drive to Baltimore? Why write a suicide note days before? Why the lidocaine? No, this wasn't a mistake. This was a script. And someone wrote the ending. Theory 2, the suicide. The official verdict. The easy answer. Annie wanted to die, so she planned it all. The note, the car, the poison. But let's be real. Suicide is rarely this theatrical. Why write a note before you disappear? Why drive 100 miles to die in a dumpster? Why mix 2 poisons, one to numb you, one to kill you, when either alone would have worked? And why leave no fingerprints in the car? Unless Annie wasn't just escaping her life, she was erasing herself, scrubbing her existence from the world. But that doesn't sound like fear. That sounds like rage. And Annie wasn't angry. She was terrified of everything. Theory 3, the murder. This is where the shadows grow teeth. Someone knew Annie. Someone she trusted. They groomed her online, promised her escape, then lured her to Baltimore. They forced her to drink the antifreeze, injected her with lidocaine to keep her quiet, dumped her body like trash. But who? The man in the red cap? A stranger? A friend? And why leave the note? A taunt? A cover-up? Maybe the killer made her write it days earlier, then staged her death to look like a suicide. But if that's true, where's the proof? Where's the DNA? The motive? The why? Theory 4, the mercy killing. The darkest theory. The one no one wants to say out loud. What if someone close to Annie, someone who saw her drowning in fear, decided to free her? To end her pain in a way that looked like suicide. They gave her the lidocaine to numb her, the antifreeze to kill her. They drove her to Baltimore to make it look like she ran away. They left the note to seal the story. But if that's true, why the dumpster? Why not let her die peacefully at home? Why the gruesome, lonely end? And who would do that? A parent? A sibling? A friend? No, this theory isn't about Annie. It's about us. Our need to believe someone cared enough to kill her. The unanswered questions. If it was suicide, why no goodbye to her parents in the note? Just I'm sorry? If it was murder, why no signs of struggle? No screams? No witnesses? If it was an accident, why the lidocaine? The clean car? The dated note? The truth is, none of these theories fit. They're all missing pieces. The suicide lacks logic. The murder lacks evidence. The accident lacks motive. And the mercy killing lacks mercy. But maybe that's the point. Maybe Annie's death wasn't a single truth. It was all of them. A girl who wanted to disappear. A killer who wanted her gone. A family who couldn't let go. And a system that didn't care enough to look. So here we are, 15 years later. A cold case, a grieving family, and a ticking clock that's run out of time. Because without a witness, without a confession, without a miracle, Annie McCann will forever be the girl who vanished twice. Once in life, once in death. And the only thing left is the noise of theories clashing in the dark. The legacy, a family's fight for answers, soft. Mournful piano returns, sparse and fragile, like a fading heartbeat. Grief does one of 2 things to people. It breaks them, or it turns them into warriors. For Annie's parents, it did both. Imagine spending years of your life chasing a ghost, hiring private investigators who take your money but find nothing, filing lawsuits against police departments that call your daughter's death a waste of time, begging strangers on street corners to remember a face they never knew. Annie's family did all of it. They sold their cars, remortgaged their house, turned their living room into a war room, walls plastered with maps, timelines, and the smiling face of a girl the world had already forgotten. In 2010, they tracked down a man who claimed he'd seen Annie alive days after her supposed suicide. He swore he saw her at a Baltimore bus stop, shivering in a pink hoodie, staring at the ground like she was waiting for permission to exist. The family rushed to the city, handed out flyers, scoured security footage, but the cameras had been wiped. The man changed his story, and the police said, "Let it go." They didn't. They petitioned to exhume Annie's body in 2012, demanding a second autopsy. The report came back the same: antifreeze, lidocaine, no signs of struggle. But this time, the toxicologist added a single line that changed nothing and everything. The combination of substances suggests premeditation. Premeditation, a word that hung in the air like a verdict. Suicide is premeditated. So is murder. But the police didn't budge. By 2015, the family was broken. But still, they fought. They launched a Facebook page, Justice for Annie McCann, posting daily reminders of her birthday, her favorite books, the way she'd hum church hymns while folding laundry. Strangers sent tips. A woman in Ohio swore Annie was her neighbor. A trucker claimed he'd picked her up hitchhiking. Every lead collapsed. Every hope dissolved. Then, in 2018, a breakthrough. A retired detective reviewed the case pro bono. He found a gap in the lidocaine timeline, a 2-hour window where Annie could have been injected after the antifreeze. He argued it pointed to murder. The family rallied. They held press conferences. They trended on Twitter. But the district attorney refused to reopen the case. Insufficient evidence. They said, let her rest. Today, Annie's case is colder than the Baltimore winter she died in. Her parents still live in the same house, the same street, the same silence. They don't answer the phone past 9 p.m., a habit left over from the days when every call could be the call. They keep her room untouched, her socks folded, her textbooks open to pages she'll never read. But here's what they've learned. The truth isn't buried in dumpsters or toxicology reports. It's buried in the people who look away. The cops who called it case closed. The politicians who shrugged. The public who scrolled past her story. Annie's legacy isn't just a mystery, it's a mirror. It shows us how easy it is to let a girl vanish twice. Once in life, once in memory. And yet, her family still lights a candle every November 1st. They still whisper her name into the dark. Because grief isn't just pain, it's a promise. A promise that as long as they're breathing, Annie McCann isn't gone. She's just waiting. Annie McCann's story isn't about a dumpster. It's not about a car, or a note, or even a poison that numbs you to death. It's about the wounds we carry that never scar. The ones that don't bleed. The ones we hide behind straight A's, folded laundry, and Bible verses taped to mirrors. Annie didn't just die from antifreeze and lidocaine. She died from silence. The silence of a world that tells girls to swallow their pain, to smile through their fear, to rot quietly in the dark so no one has to smell it. Her death certificate says suicide, but that's just a word that erases the real question. Why did a girl who spent her life terrified of failure fail so spectacularly at dying? Think about it. If you wanted to vanish, would you write a note beforehand? Would you steal a car you couldn't drive? Would you choose a poison that takes hours to kill you, in a city you'd never seen? Or is that what happens when you've spent your whole life playing a part? When you're so numb to your own pain that even your death becomes a performance? Annie's story is a warning, a flare shot into the dark. Because for every girl like her, girls who laugh a little too loud, who apologize a little too much, who fold their socks into perfect squares to keep the chaos at bay, there's a world that refuses to see them until they're gone, until their bodies turn into riddles, until their parents turn into ghosts. So the next time you hear about a suicide that doesn't fit, a note that feels staged, a death that feels scripted, a grief that feels too loud, don't look at the evidence. Look at the silence around it. The cops who stopped digging, the neighbors who stopped asking, the system that called her a case instead of a daughter. Annie McCann isn't a mystery. She's a mirror, and what she reflects back isn't pretty. It's a world that's allergic to uncomfortable truths. A world that would rather call a girl suicidal than admit it failed her. A world where numbness isn't just physical, it's cultural. So remember her, not as a victim, or a statistic, or a true crime trope. Remember her as a question that burns louder every time someone says, let it go. A question that doesn't ask what happened, but who let it happen. And long after this video ends, let that question follow you. Let it keep you up at night. Let it turn you into someone who refuses to stop asking. Why? For Annie, and the ones the world chooses not to see.